Every parent's worst nightmare is a child who never comes home. For 11 long years, the Harper family lived with that unbearable grief. 2 little girls vanished without a trace, swallowed by the vast wilderness. When 60-year-old tracker Silas Boone rides deep into the northern woods looking for stray cattle, he expects nothing more than a quiet afternoon. Instead, he finds a hidden cabin, a carefully tended garden, and 2 young women who shouldn't exist. They're alive. Against all odds, the Harper sisters survived over a decade in complete isolation, raised in secrecy by a mother desperate to protect them from a violent past. But how did they endure? And what dark truth kept them hidden all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Silas Boone had learned long ago that the wilderness doesn't give up its secrets easily. At 60, he moved through the dense pine forest with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent more of his life outdoors than in. His worn leather boots barely made a sound on the carpet of needles beneath his feet, and his eyes, still sharp despite the years, scanned the ground with the kind of attention most folks reserved for reading the morning paper. The compass in his vest pocket had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather. The brass casing was smooth from decades of handling, the glass face scratched but still clear enough to read. Silas touched it now out of habit, feeling its familiar weight, though he hardly needed it anymore. These woods were as familiar to him as the lines on his own weathered face. He'd ridden out from his small ranch just after dawn, following the trail of 3 heifers that had wandered through a broken section of fence. It wasn't the first time cattle had gotten loose. Happened every few months when a tree fell or the wire rusted. But it was the first time they'd headed this deep into the northern section. Most animals stayed closer to the cleared land, where the grazing was easier and the shadows less thick. The morning air carried the scent of pine sap and damp earth. Last night's rain had left everything glistening, and droplets still clung to the low-hanging branches, catching the filtered sunlight like tiny prisms. Silas paused to study a fresh hoofprint pressed into the soft ground. The edges were clean, sharp, made within the last few hours, he figured. The cattle were moving steadily northeast, which struck him as odd. That direction led deeper into the unmarked territory, where the forest grew thick and tangled, where even experienced hunters sometimes got turned around. He'd been tracking for nearly 40 years, learned the skill from his father just as his father had learned it from his own. It was more than just reading signs on the ground. It was understanding the land itself, the way animals moved through it, the patterns they followed, the places they avoided. His father used to say that good tracking was 10% eyes and 90% thinking. You had to know not just where something had been, but where it was likely going and why. Silas's ranch sat on 200 acres at the edge of Millbrook County, a place where folks still knew their neighbors and helped out when times got hard. He'd inherited the land from his parents 15 years back after his mother passed. His father had died in a logging accident when Silas was just 23, leaving him to run the place alone until he'd married Margaret 3 years later. Margaret, even now, 5 years after losing her to cancer, he still reached for her in the morning sometimes, forgetting for that first confused moment that her side of the bed would be empty. They'd had 30 good years together, raised a daughter named Sarah, who now lived down in Portland with her husband and 2 boys. She called every Sunday without fail, worried about her old man living alone out here. He always told her the same thing, that he was doing just fine, that the work kept him busy, that he wasn't lonely with the land and the animals for company. Mostly, it was true. The ranch wasn't much by modern standards. A modest 2-story house with a wraparound porch, a barn that needed new shingles, a chicken coop, and about 30 head of cattle. Silas also did tracking work on the side, helping hunters find game, assisting the county sheriff's department when someone got lost in the wilderness, which happened more often than people like to admit. Just last year, he'd found a confused elderly man who'd wandered away from a campsite, sitting calm as you please under a cedar tree, having no idea he'd been missing for 2 days. The Harper case, though, that one had haunted him. Everyone in the county remembered when those little girls disappeared. Emma and Claire Harper, ages 7 and 9 at the time. Their mother, Catherine Harper, had been a quiet woman, kept mostly to herself after divorcing her husband years earlier. She worked at the county library and lived in a small house on the outskirts of town with her daughters. One September morning, all 3 of them were just gone. House empty, car in the driveway, doors unlocked. No note, no explanation, no signs of struggle. The sheriff organized the biggest search party the county had ever seen. Volunteers combed through hundreds of acres of forest, checked abandoned buildings, questioned everyone who might have seen something. Silas had been part of that search, spending 2 weeks walking grid patterns through the woods, looking for any trace of them. They'd found nothing. Not a single footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not even a disturbed patch of ground that might suggest where they'd gone. After 6 months, the official search was called off. Most folks assumed the worst, that Catherine had driven somewhere far away and done something terrible, or that they'd met with foul play. The ex-husband, Michael Harper, had been questioned extensively, but he had an airtight alibi and seemed genuinely devastated. The case went cold, became one of those dark stories that communities carry like a scar, something people mentioned in hushed tones when talking about how even good places can harbor mysteries. Silas had thought about those girls more times than he could count over the years, wondered if there was something he'd missed, some sign he should have caught. He'd walked those search grids so carefully, examined every broken branch and disturbed leaf, but the wilderness had kept it secret, if indeed there was a secret to keep. Now, following these wandering cattle through terrain he rarely visited, Silas noticed something that made him stop. The hoofprints continued northeast, but there was something else, a faint trail, barely visible, cutting perpendicular to the cattle's path. Not a game trail, those ran different. This was narrower, more deliberate. The kind of path that gets made by the same feet, walking the same route over and over again. It was old, mostly overgrown, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. His instinct told him to follow the cattle, but something about that trail pulled at him, some tracker's intuition that had been honed over decades. He stood there in the dappled sunlight, weighing his options, feeling the weight of his father's compass in his pocket, like it might offer guidance beyond just pointing north. The cattle could wait an hour or 2. They weren't going anywhere they couldn't be found later. This trail, though, this was something different, something worth investigating. Silas adjusted his hat and started following the narrow path, moving slowly, noting how deliberately it had been concealed in places. Branches had been arranged to hide the route from casual observation. Someone had maintained this trail and worked hard to keep it hidden. That alone set off alarm bells. In all his years tracking these woods, he'd never seen anything quite like it. The forest grew denser as he moved deeper in. Old-growth cedars towered overhead, their massive trunks thick with moss. The underbrush tangled in places, forcing him to move carefully, but the trail, once he knew to look for it, remained visible to his experienced eye. Broken twigs at knee height, stones pressed deeper into the soil, a pattern of disturbed pine needles. He'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when he smelled smoke. Not the acrid smell of a forest fire, but wood smoke, the kind that came from a controlled fire, a campfire, or a wood stove. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his back, not to draw it, just to confirm it was there. He wasn't expecting trouble, but habit and caution had kept him safe for 6 decades. The trail curved around a massive boulder, and Silas slowed his approach. He could hear something now, a faint, rhythmic sound. An axe, maybe, striking wood. He moved forward carefully, stepping around the boulder, and then he stopped completely, his breath catching in his throat. There, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, stood a cabin. Not some ramshackle hunting shelter, but an actual cabin, small but solid, with a stone chimney from which thin smoke rose. Beside it, a carefully tended garden showed neat rows of vegetables. A chicken coop sat to one side, and he could hear the soft clucking of hens. Firewood was stacked precisely against the cabin wall. Everything about the scene spoke of permanence, of careful maintenance, of people living here not temporarily, but as a home. And standing in front of the garden, frozen in the act of hoeing between the rows, were two young women staring directly at him with wide, startled eyes. They couldn't have been much older than 20-something, both wearing simple, handmade dresses that looked like they belonged to another era. One held the hoe like a weapon, knuckles white around the wooden handle. The other had dropped to a protective crouch, ready to run or fight. But it was their faces that stopped Silas cold. Even across the distance, even after 11 years, even though they'd grown from children into young adults, he knew those faces. He'd stared at their photographs for 2 straight weeks during the search, memorizing every detail, hoping against hope that he'd find them alive. The Harper sisters, Emma and Claire, alive. Here, after all this time, for a long moment, nobody moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them. Silas slowly raised both hands, palms out, showing he meant no harm. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to understand how this was possible. They'd searched this area. He'd personally walked grids not 3 miles from here. How had he missed this? How had everyone missed this? "Easy now," he said, softly, the way he'd talk to a spooked animal. "I'm not here to hurt you. Name's Silas Boone. I'm just a tracker from over Millbrook Way. Followed some cattle that wandered off my land. The older one, that would be Emma, now maybe 18 or 19, didn't lower the hoe. Her eyes were intelligent, assessing, weighing whether he was telling the truth. The younger sister, Claire, stayed crouched, ready to bolt. They looked healthy enough, he noted. Thin but not starved, weathered but strong. Their hair was long and simply braided. They watched him with the wariness of wild things that had learned to survive on their own. "You're the Harper girls," Silas said quietly, stating it as fact rather than question. "Emma and Claire, everyone's been looking for you. 11 years now." Something flickered across Emma's face, recognition, maybe, of her own name, or fear, or both. She glanced at her sister, some unspoken communication passing between them, then back to Silas. "Where's your mother?" Silas asked gently. "Catherine, is she here?" The question seemed to hit them differently. Claire's face crumpled slightly, and Emma's grip on the hoe tightened. That told Silas what he needed to know, even before either of them spoke. Emma finally opened her mouth, and her voice came out rough, like someone who didn't speak often or loudly. "You need to leave. Please. You can't be here." "I understand you're scared," Silas said, keeping his voice calm and steady. "But I can help you. If something's happened to your mother, if you're out here alone—" "We're fine," Emma cut him off, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. "We don't need help. We don't need anyone." Silas studied them both, his tracker's eye taking in details. The cabin behind them was solid work, but old. The garden was mature, well-established. This wasn't recent. They'd been here the whole time. Someone had built this place, maintained it, kept these girls hidden for over a decade. The time and implications of that crashed over him like a wave. "How long has it been?" he asked softly. "Since your mother." 3 years, Claire whispered, and Emma shot her a sharp look, but the younger sister's eyes had filled with tears. 3 years this October. Please don't make us leave. This is our home. This is all we have." And in that moment, standing in that hidden clearing with 2 young women who should have been found years ago, who'd somehow survived alone in the wilderness, who were terrified of him despite his offered help, Silas Boone realized he'd stumbled into something far more complicated than lost cattle. He'd found the answer to an 11-year-old mystery, and with it, 1,000 new questions that needed answering. The wilderness had finally given up its secret. Now he had to figure out what to do with it. Silas didn't move from his spot at the edge of the clearing. Every instinct told him that one wrong move would send these young women running into the forest, like deer, and he might never find them again. He'd tracked enough frightened animals to recognize that particular kind of tension, the way muscles coiled in preparation for flight, the way eyes measured distance to safety. "I'm going to sit down right here," he said slowly, suiting action to words as he lowered himself onto a moss-covered log. "Not coming any closer. Just going to sit and talk for a bit, if that's all right with you." Emma and Claire exchanged another glance. After a long moment, Emma set the hoe down not far from reach, but down nonetheless. Claire straightened from her crouch, but stayed close to her sister, their shoulders almost touching. They were a unit, Silas realized. 11 years of having only each other had forged a bond deeper than most siblings ever knew. "You said everyone's looking for us," Emma said carefully. "That's not possible. We've been here the whole time. If people were looking, they would have found us." "They did look," Silas said. "Biggest search party this county ever organized. 2 weeks of volunteers combing these woods. I was part of it." He paused, letting that sink in. "Your mother knew what she was doing. This place, it's hidden in a way that takes real knowledge of the land. She must have found it before you disappeared, maybe prepared it." Claire's eyes widened. "You were there? You were looking for us?" "Yes, ma'am. Walked grid patterns for 14 days straight. Your pictures were posted all over town. Your father, your biological father, Michael, he was beside himself. Still asks about you sometimes when I see him at the feed store." Something complicated crossed both their faces at the mention of their father. Fear, definitely, but also longing, maybe, or pain. Silas couldn't quite read it. Emma said flatly, "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you came here to do, we can't go back there, we won't." "Why not?" Silas asked gently. "What were you running from?" The sisters were quiet for a long moment. A breeze moved through the clearing, rustling the leaves overhead. One of the chickens clucked softly from the coop. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't running. Mama was protecting us." "From what?" "From him," Emma said, and her voice carried an edge now. "Our father. He hurt Mama. For years he hurt her. The divorce didn't stop it. He kept coming around, making threats, showing up at the house. The police couldn't do anything, because he was always careful, always made sure there were no witnesses, no evidence. So Mama took us somewhere he could never find us." Silas felt his chest tighten. He'd seen his share of domestic violence cases over the years, helped the sheriff track down more than one abusive husband who'd violated a restraining order. It was an ugly truth about small towns that people preferred not to discuss the violence that happened behind closed doors, the terror that wore a familiar face. "Your mother," he said carefully. "You said she passed 3 years ago. Can you tell me what happened?" Claire's eyes filled with tears again. Emma put an arm around her sister's shoulders, protective and fierce. When Emma spoke, her voice was steady, but Silas could hear the grief underneath it. "There was an accident. She was cutting firewood we always needed, so much firewood for winter, and the axe slipped, cut deep into her leg. We tried everything we knew. Mama had taught us about herbs, about bandaging, about keeping wounds clean, but it got infected anyway. She got a fever. It lasted for 4 days, and then she was gone." The brutal simplicity of it hit Silas hard. A woman who'd successfully hidden herself and her daughters for 8 years, who'd built them a life in the wilderness, who'd taught them to survive, taken by something as simple and terrible as an infected wound, something that any emergency room could have treated easily. He thought about his own wife, how cancer had taken her despite every modern medical intervention available. But Margaret had at least had those interventions, had died in a clean hospital bed surrounded by people who loved her. Catherine Harper had died alone, except for her terrified daughters, in a cabin miles from help, from a preventable infection. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm truly sorry. We buried her behind the cabin," Claire said quietly. "Under the pine tree she liked best." Emma carved her name into it. Silas looked at them both, these young women who'd been 7 and 9 when they disappeared, who'd grown up completely isolated from the world, who'd watched their mother die and somehow kept surviving afterward. The strength that took, the resilience, it was almost beyond comprehension. "You've been alone here for 3 years," he said. "No contact with anyone, no supplies from town, living off what you grow and what you can hunt or gather." "Mama taught us," Emma said with a hint of pride. "She taught us everything. How to preserve food for winter, how to trap rabbits, how to know which plants are safe to eat, how to keep the cabin warm when the snow gets deep, how to read the weather and predict when storms are coming. We know this land better than anyone. We're good at surviving." "I can see that," Silas acknowledged. "But surviving isn't the same as living. You're both adults now, or near enough. The world's moved on these past 11 years. Technology, opportunities, education. There's a whole life out there you've never experienced. A life where our father could find us," Emma said sharply. "Where he could hurt us the way he hurt Mama. That's not a life worth having." Silas leaned forward slightly. "Your father is 63 years old now. He's got arthritis bad enough he walks with a cane. And the law's different now. They take domestic violence more seriously than they did back then. There are protections available that didn't exist 11 years ago." "You don't understand," Claire said, and there was desperation in her voice now. "Mama made us promise. The night before she died, when the fever was so bad she could barely speak, she made us both swear we'd stay hidden. She said he'd never stop looking, that he'd find a way to hurt us no matter what the law said. She died trying to keep us safe. We can't just throw that away because some stranger found our cabin." The word stranger stung, though Silas knew it was accurate. To them, he was a stranger. They had no memory of the community that had searched for them, no connection to the life they'd left behind. This cabin, this clearing, this isolated existence, it was all they really knew. "I understand that promise means something to you," Silas said carefully, "but you've got to understand my position too. I can't just walk away from here knowing you're out here alone. You're not children anymore, but you're also not prepared for what winter's going to bring. 3 years might seem like a long time, but what happens if one of you gets hurt? What happens if the crops fail? What happens when you're 40 or 50 and still living out here with no medical care, no community, no support?" "We'll manage," Emma said stubbornly. "We always have." "Maybe," Silas agreed, "but that doesn't make it right." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his father's compass, turning it over in his weathered hands. The brass caught the filtered sunlight. Both sisters watched the movement warily. "This belonged to my father," Silas said, "and his father before him, got passed down through 3 generations of Boone men. My daddy taught me to track using this compass, taught me to read the land, to understand the wilderness. He died when I was 23, and I thought I knew everything I needed to know. Turned out I was wrong. Took me years to learn that knowing the wilderness isn't the same as knowing how to live a full life." He looked up at them. "Your mother loved you enough to give up everything, her home, her community, her whole life to keep you safe. That's a powerful thing. But I don't think she'd want you trapped out here forever, living in fear of a man who might not even be a threat anymore. Sometimes protecting someone means teaching them to face the world, not hide from it." Emma's jaw tightened. "You're going to tell people we're here, aren't you? You're going to tell the sheriff." "I'm going to do what's right," Silas said, "but I need some time to figure out what that means. What I'm asking is that you give me a chance to help you. Not to drag you back to town against your will, but to help you understand what your options are. Let me be a bridge between this life and the one you might want to have." "And if we say no," Emma asked, "then I'll have to make a decision about what to do with what I've learned," Silas said honestly, "and I can't promise you'll like that decision, but I'd rather work with you than around you." The sisters looked at each other again, that silent communication passing between them. Silas waited, patient as he'd learned to be from years of tracking, of watching, of understanding that sometimes you had to let the moment unfold at its own pace. Finally, Claire spoke. "Can you give us until tomorrow to think about it?" "I can do that," Silas said. "I'll come back tomorrow morning, same time. We'll talk more then." He stood slowly, making no sudden movements. "One more thing," he said. I'm sorry about your mother. From what you've told me, she sounds like she was a brave woman who did what she thought was right. That's worth respecting, even when we might disagree about the choices she made." Neither sister responded, but something in their postures softened slightly. Silas took that as the closest thing to acceptance he was likely to get today. He turned and walked back toward the trail, feeling their eyes on his back every step of the way. Only when he'd rounded the boulder and was out of sight did he let out the breath he'd been holding. He'd found the Harper sisters. After 11 years, he'd found them alive. But in doing so, he'd inherited a responsibility that felt heavier than any he'd carried in a long time. Their fate now rested partly in his weathered hands, and whatever choice he made would change their lives forever. The compass in his pocket seemed to weigh more than brass and glass had any right to weigh. Silas found his cattle 2 miles east of the hidden clearing, grazing peacefully in a meadow they'd discovered. He rounded them up mechanically, his mind elsewhere, replaying the encounter with the Harper sisters over and over. The ride back to his ranch took 3 hours, and by the time he'd gotten the heifers secured and the broken fence mended, the sun was setting in streaks of orange and purple across the western sky. Inside his house, he heated up yesterday's stew without tasting it, eating at the kitchen table, while darkness settled outside. The silence felt heavier than usual. Margaret used to fill these evening hours with conversation, with the small details of her day, with plans for tomorrow. Now there was just the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the sound of his own breathing. He washed his bowl and stood at the sink, staring out the window at his reflection ghosted against the dark glass. What was he going to do? The question circled in his mind like a hawk searching for prey. He had a legal obligation to report what he'd found. Those girls were listed as missing persons, presumed dead. Their father had a right to know his daughters were alive. The community deserved closure after 11 years of mystery. But there was also the promise Catherine Harper had extracted from her daughters as she lay dying. A mother's desperate final wish to keep her children safe from a man she feared. Was that fear justified? Michael Harper had never been charged with domestic violence, never arrested, never even officially investigated as far as Silas knew. But absence of charges didn't mean absence of crime. He'd lived long enough to know that some of the worst abuse happened in shadows, carefully hidden, leaving no bruises that showed. His phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the caller ID, Sarah, his daughter. Their Sunday call. He'd completely forgotten what day it was. "Hey, sweetheart," he answered, trying to keep his voice normal. "Dad, you sound tired. Everything okay?" Sarah had her mother's intuition, that uncanny ability to read him even through a phone line. "Long day, tracking some cattle that got loose. Nothing I couldn't handle. You're doing too much out there by yourself. You know, Tom and I have been talking. There's a nice assisted living place here in Portland with, 'I'm 60, not 90, Silas said, but he softened it with a chuckle. "And I don't need assistance living. The ranch is manageable, and I like the work. Keeps me young." "It keeps you isolated," Sarah countered gently. "When was the last time you had dinner with another human being? When was the last time you went into town for something other than supplies?" "Had coffee with Bill Henderson last Tuesday," Silas said, which was true if you counted them both ordering coffee at the feed store and talking for 10 minutes about the weather. Sarah sighed. "Dad, I worry about you out there alone. The boys ask about you all the time. They miss their grandpa. Tell them I miss them too. Maybe I'll drive down for Thanksgiving if the weather holds." They talked for another 20 minutes about Sarah's job at the architectural firm, about his grandson's school activities, about nothing and everything. When they hung up, Silas felt the silence close in again, but now it carried guilt too. Sarah was right to worry. He was isolated, and now he'd stumbled into something that made that isolation feel even more acute. He had no one to talk this through with, no one to help him make sense of the moral knot he'd found himself tied into. He thought about calling Sheriff Tom Morrison. Tom was a decent man, fair-minded, someone Silas had worked with on various cases over the years. Tom would know what to do legally. But once Silas made that call, the decision would be out of his hands. The machinery of law and society would grind into motion, and Emma and Claire would be swept up in it, whether they wanted to be or not. Silas pulled out a photograph from the drawer in the living room, one of the missing person flyers from 11 years ago. The Harper family stared back at him, Catherine, pretty but tired-looking, with worry lines around her eyes. Emma and Claire, gap-toothed and grinning, holding hands. They'd been at a county fair, he remembered. This photo had been taken just 2 months before they disappeared. He studied Michael Harper in the photo, standing slightly separate from his ex-wife and daughters, one hand resting on young Emma's shoulder. A tall man, broad-shouldered, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Or maybe that was just Silas projecting, knowing what he knew now. The truth was, Michael Harper seemed like a perfectly ordinary man. He worked as a mechanic at Johnson's Auto Repair, had lived in Millbrook his whole life, attended church most Sundays. After the disappearance, he'd been investigated thoroughly and cleared of any involvement. The divorce had been contentious, sure, but plenty of divorces were contentious without involving violence. Still, Silas had learned to trust his gut over the years. And something about the way Emma and Claire had reacted when he mentioned their father that wasn't the reaction of daughters who missed a beloved parent. That was fear, pure and raw. He made himself a cup of coffee, knowing sleep would be impossible anyway, and sat in his worn recliner. The house creaked and settled around him the way old houses do. He thought about the cabin he'd found today, about how carefully it had been hidden, how well maintained. Catherine Harper must have prepared it for months, maybe years, before she finally took her daughters and disappeared. She'd learned survival skills somehow, taught herself and then taught her children. That took planning, determination, and a level of desperation that spoke to genuine fear. But 3 years. The girls had been alone for 3 years, isolated from every aspect of normal life. They were technically adults, now Emma was at least 18 or 19, but they'd missed crucial years of development, of education, of socialization. They didn't know how to navigate the modern world. They probably didn't have social security cards, driver's licenses, birth certificates. They existed in legal limbo, ghosts who'd never officially returned. Silas rubbed his eyes, feeling every one of his 60 years. He'd spent his whole life tracking things, animals, people, patterns, in the wilderness. But this wasn't something he could track to a clear conclusion. There were too many variables, too many ways this could go wrong, no matter what choice he made. If he reported them, they'd face immediate upheaval. Police interviews, medical examinations, psychiatric evaluations. Media attention. The story would be sensational. 2 girls found alive after 11 years. Their faces would be on every news channel, every newspaper. Privacy would be impossible. And Michael Harper would know exactly where they were. If he didn't report them, he was potentially condemning them to a life of continued isolation. What kind of future did they have in that cabin? What happened when they got sick or injured? When they grew old? They were strong now, resilient. But time humbles everyone eventually. He knew that from personal experience. There was a third option, he realized. He could help them himself, quietly, without involving authorities. Bring them supplies, teach them about the modern world gradually, help them decide for themselves when and if they were ready to return. It would mean visits to the cabin, time spent building trust, patience. It would mean keeping a secret that weighed on him. But it would also mean giving them agency over their own lives, respecting Catherine Harper's final wishes while still offering her daughters a bridge to the wider world. It wasn't a perfect solution, but Silas had lived long enough to know that perfect solutions were rare as hen's teeth. The clock struck midnight. Silas finished his coffee and made a decision. He'd go back tomorrow as promised. He'd talk to the sisters again, learn more about their life, their fears, their hopes, if they had any. He'd offer to help them on their terms. And he'd keep their secret, at least for now, until he better understood what the right path forward might be. It was a risk. It might be the wrong choice. But it was the only one he could live with tonight. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, his knees protesting slightly. Through the window, he could see stars scattered across the clear night sky, the same stars that shone down on a hidden cabin deep in the northern woods, on two young women trying to sleep while wondering whether tomorrow would bring help or destruction. Silas hoped he'd have the wisdom to tell the difference. Silas arrived at the hidden clearing just after sunrise, carrying a canvas pack over his shoulder. He'd stopped at the edge of the trail this time, making enough noise that they'd hear him coming rather than startling them again. When he rounded the boulder, both sisters were waiting, standing near the cabin door. Emma still held herself with that defensive posture, but Claire looked more curious than frightened today. "Morning," Silas called out, stopping a respectful distance away. "Thought you might appreciate some coffee. Real coffee, not whatever you've been substituting." He pulled out a thermos and 2 tin cups from his Rubend pack, setting them on a flat rock. Also brought some sugar, salt, and matches. "Figured these are things you might need but can't exactly make yourselves." Emma eyed the supplies suspiciously. "We told you we'd think about it. That doesn't mean we decided to accept help." "Haven't asked you to decide anything yet," Silas said mildly. "Just brought some basics. Whether you take them or not is up to you." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down on the same log as yesterday, taking a slow sip. "Beautiful morning. That garden of yours is impressive. Your mother taught you well." Claire moved first, drawn by the rich smell of the coffee. She picked up one of the tin cups, and Emma shot her a warning look, but didn't stop her. After a moment, Emma followed, and both sisters sat on a fallen log across from Silas, cradling the warm cups like precious objects. "We haven't had real coffee in 3 years, Claire said quietly, closing her eyes as she took her first sip. "Mama used to make it from acorns and chicory root. It was okay, but not like this." "Your mother was resourceful," Silas observed. "This whole place, the cabin, the garden, the way it's hidden, takes serious planning and skill. She must have been preparing for a long time before you came here." Emma nodded slowly. 2 years, I think. She'd take day trips, said she was going hiking, but really she was building this place, stocking it, making it ready. We didn't know about it until the night we left. She woke us up around midnight, said we had to go right then. Couldn't bring anything but 1 bag each. We drove for hours with the headlights off, just moonlight. I was so scared. "You were just kids," Silas said. "That must have been terrifying." "We trusted Mama," Emma said firmly. "She said it was the only way to keep us safe, so we believed her." Silas took another sip of coffee, considering his words carefully. "Can you tell me what your father did? I'm not asking to judge or to catch you in a lie. I'm asking because I need to understand what you're afraid of." The sisters exchanged looks again. Finally, Emma spoke, her voice flat, reciting facts rather than reliving emotions. "He was careful. Never hit us where it would show. Never in front of witnesses. The divorce happened when I was 6 and Claire was 4. Mama got custody, but he got visitation rights. Every other weekend, we'd have to go to his house. He never hurt us during those visits, just watched us with this look that said he could if he wanted to. But Mama, she'd always have new bruises when she'd pick us up. She'd say she fell, or walked into a door, or some other excuse. The police were called twice," Claire added. "Once by a neighbor who heard screaming. Once by Mama's boss at the library, who noticed fingerprint bruises on her arms. Both times, Daddy said it was a misunderstanding. Said Mama was trying to turn people against him because of the divorce. Both times, nothing happened. And the 3rd time," Emma continued, "Mama didn't call the police. She just started planning our disappearance instead. She said the system couldn't protect us, so she'd have to do it herself." Silas absorbed this, his jaw tight. He'd seen cases like this before. Domestic violence that fell through the cracks, abusers who knew exactly how to work the system. It made his blood simmer, but he kept his voice level. "Your father's older now. I've seen him around town. He walks with a cane, moves slow. Doesn't seem like the same threat he might have been 11 years ago." "Age doesn't change what's in someone's heart," Emma said sharply. A wolf with a broken leg is still a wolf. Fair point, Silas had to admit. What about other family? Your mother's parents, siblings, anyone who might have wanted to help? Mama's parents died before we were born, Claire said. Car accident. She was an only child. Daddy's family, they never believed Mama. Said she was making things up because she wanted money in the divorce. They took his side. So the sisters truly had no one, no safety net, no support system beyond what their mother had provided and what they'd built themselves. Silas felt the weight of that isolation acutely. I've been thinking, he said, about what I could do to help without breaking your trust. I'm proposing something different from what you might expect. I won't tell anyone you're here, not yet, anyway. But I'd like to visit regularly, bring supplies you need, maybe teach you things about the modern world that might be useful, give you time to adjust to the idea of other people, to understand your options. Then, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, we can figure out together how to handle your return. Emma studied him with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Why would you do that? What's in it for you? Nothing, Silas said honestly, except maybe sleeping better at night knowing I did the right thing. He paused. I lost my wife 5 years back. Cancer. Those last few months, I'd have done anything to protect her, to keep her safe, to give her more time. I couldn't. But your mother, she did protect you. She gave everything she had to keep you safe. I can't help but respect that, even if I don't agree with all her choices. Helping you feels like honoring what she tried to do. Something in Emma's expression softened slightly. You really won't tell anyone? Not without your permission. But in return, I need you to trust me enough to let me help. That means being honest with me about what you need, what you're struggling with. It means not disappearing if something spooks you. Can you do that? The sisters looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them again. After a long moment, both nodded. We can try, Emma said carefully. But if we think you're going to betray us, then you'll run, and I'll never find you again, Silas finished. I understand. That's fair. Claire stood and walked to the Silas cabin, returning a moment later with a worn leather journal. She held it protectively against her chest. This was Mama's. She wrote in it almost every day about this place, about survival skills, about her reasons for bringing us here, about who she was afraid of, and why. She handed it to Silas with trembling hands. Read it, then you'll understand. Silas took the journal carefully, feeling the weight of the trust they were placing in him. The leather was cracked and faded, the pages yellowed. Catherine Harper's handwriting covered every page in neat, careful script. I'll read it tonight, he promised, and I'll bring it back tomorrow when I come, along with more supplies. He stood, tucking the journal carefully into his pack. Is there anything specific you need? Things you can't make or grow yourselves? Medicine, Claire said immediately. For pain, for fever, and needles, sewing needles and fishing line. Ours are wearing out. I can do that, Silas said. Anything else? Emma hesitated, then spoke quietly. Books. We've read Mama's books so many times we've memorized them. It would be nice to read something new. Books I can definitely do, Silas said, feeling a small smile tug at his lips. The request was so normal, so human. These young women might have lived isolated from society, but they were still curious, still wanted to learn and grow. That gave him hope. As he walked back down the hidden trail toward his horse, Silas felt Catherine Harper's journal against his back like a weight of responsibility. Tonight he'd read her words, understand her fears, see through her eyes why she'd made the choices she did. And maybe, just maybe, he'd begin to understand how to help her daughters find their way back to the world without destroying the sanctuary their mother had died to create. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches above, and somewhere in the distance a bird sang. It felt like the beginning of something, though Silas couldn't yet say whether it would end in salvation or heartbreak. That evening, after finishing his chores and heating up a simple dinner, Silas settled into his recliner with Catherine Harper's journal. He'd made a fresh pot of coffee, knowing this would be a long night. The leather cover was soft under his fingers as he opened to the first page. June 3rd, I found it. After 6 months of searching, I finally found the perfect place. A clearing deep in the North Woods, far from any trail, surrounded by dense forest that would hide us. There's an old hunter's cabin, abandoned for maybe 20 years, but the bones are good. I can repair it. I can make it home. Silas read on, watching Catherine Harper's determination unfold across the pages. She wrote about her preparations with meticulous detail, how she'd spent weekends making repairs to the cabin, always careful to hide her tracks, to leave no obvious trail, how she'd stockpiled supplies gradually, buying a little extra each, shopping trip, so as not to raise suspicion, canned goods, seeds, tools, medicine, warm clothes for growing children. She'd thought of everything. August 15th, Michael showed up at the library today during my shift. Just walked in like he had every right to be there, stood at the counter, staring at me while I helped patrons. Didn't say a word, didn't need to. The message was clear. I'm watching you. I'm always watching. Linda, from circulation, asked if I was okay after he left. I lied and said he was just being friendly. How many lies have I told to keep this secret? How many more will I have to tell? Between the pages, Silas found a pressed wildflower, brittle with age. A small beauty preserved in the midst of fear. He handled it carefully, setting it aside before continuing. The entries grew more detailed as Catherine's plans solidified. She wrote about teaching herself wilderness survival from library books, practicing skills in secret. She described her terror every time. Michael appeared unannounced, every time his phone calls turned threatening when no one else was listening. She documented the date of every bruise, every intimidation tactic, creating a record that no one would ever see because the system had failed her too many times already. September 2nd, I told the girls we're going on an adventure. Emma asked if Daddy's coming. The hope in her voice broke my heart. They don't understand what he is. They see him during visits when he's playing the role of father, controlled and calculated. They don't see the man who corners me in parking lots, who makes threats against them if I don't do what he wants. How do you explain that kind of evil to children without destroying their innocence? Silas paused, rubbing his tired eyes. He thought about Emma and Claire's faces today, the way they'd described their father with such fear. They'd learned eventually, though Catherine had tried to shield them. Some truths couldn't be hidden forever. September 22nd. Tomorrow night. I've checked the cabin one last time. The garden is planted. The wood is stacked. The supplies are stored. I've left nothing to chance. We'll drive with the headlights off until we're far enough from town. I'll hide the car in the ravine I found, let them think we drove away, left the state. Let them search everywhere except where we actually are. The girls will hate me at first, maybe. They'll miss their friends, their school, their normal life. But they'll be alive. They'll be safe. That's all that matters. The next entries were written at the cabin itself. Catherine described the first weeks of adjustment, the girls' confusion and occasional rebellion, their slow acceptance of this new reality. She wrote about establishing routines, teaching them to read the forest, to understand the rhythms of seasons and weather. Her handwriting showed her exhaustion, her determination, and underlying everything, her love for her daughters. November 8th. Emma caught her first rabbit today, using the snare I taught her to make. She was so proud. Claire helped skin it, and we made stew. They're adapting faster than I expected. Children are resilient in ways adults forget. Sometimes I watch them playing in the clearing, and I see joy there, genuine joy. Maybe this place isn't just a hiding spot. Maybe it can be a home. Months passed in the pages. Catherine documented the changing seasons, the challenges of their first winter, the small victories and setbacks. She wrote about missing her old life, hot showers, electricity, the simple pleasure of browsing bookstore shelves. But she never wrote about regretting her choice. April 3rd, Year 2. I saw a search helicopter today, far in the distance. The sound made my heart stop. Emma and Claire ran into the cabin immediately, just like we practiced. We stayed inside for 6 hours, silent, waiting. The helicopter never came close. They're still looking, but not here, not anywhere near. Here, we're ghosts. We've disappeared so completely that maybe, eventually, they'll stop looking altogether. Silas felt a chill reading those words. He'd been in that helicopter, searching grid patterns, hoping against hope to find any sign of them. He'd flown right over this area, never knowing how close he'd come. The entries continued through years 3, 4, and 5. Catherine wrote less frequently as time went on, but her entries grew more philosophical. She reflected on what she'd given up, what she'd gained, whether her choice had been right or merely necessary. She wrote about teaching the girls everything she knew, preparing them for a future she might not be part of. Year 7, August. I'm not well. Started having dizzy spells last month. Pain in my chest sometimes that takes my breath away. No way to see a doctor. No way to know what's wrong. I've written instructions for the girls about everything I can think of. How to preserve food. How to treat common illnesses. Where the best fishing spots are. How to hide if anyone comes. I'm writing this like a manual for survival, because that's what it might need to be. Silas's hands trembled slightly as he turned to the final entries. Catherine's handwriting had become shakier, less certain. Year 8, October 12th. The accident happened 3 days ago. Stupid, careless mistake. The axe slipped while I was cutting firewood, severed something in my leg, blood everywhere. The girls bandaged it as best they could, but infection has set in. I can feel the fever building. I'm trying to hide how bad it is, but Emma knows. She's always been able to read me. October 14th, fever is worse, can barely hold the pen. If this is the end, I want my girls to know I don't regret any of it. Every sacrifice, every hardship, worth it to keep them safe. I made them promise today. Made them swear they'll stay hidden, stay safe, Emma argued, wanted to try to get help, but there's no time, and even if there were, bringing them back now would expose them to the very danger I've spent 8 years protecting them from. October 15th. Getting hard to think clearly. Keep drifting. Want to tell them so much. Want them to know they can be strong, can survive anything. Want them to know about the world beyond these trees, all the beauty and wonder I've kept them from. Want them to forgive me for the choice I made. For the life I couldn't give them. The fever's so high, so tired. They're holding my hands, my beautiful girls. I'm so proud of... The entry ended there, the final words trailing off into an illegible scrawl. The next page was blank. And the page after that contained just 2 words in Emma's handwriting, crude but clear. Mama died. Silas closed the journal carefully, his vision blurred with tears. He sat in his recliner as the night deepened outside, thinking about Catherine Harper's 8-year fight to protect her daughters, about her death alone in the wilderness, about the promise she'd extracted from Emma and Claire that had kept them isolated for 3 more years. He thought about fear and love, about sacrifice and survival, about the terrible choices people sometimes had to make when the world failed them. And he thought about those 2 young women sleeping in a cabin tonight, still bound by a dying woman's final wish, still trapped between the life they'd known and the life they'd lost. The journal had given him understanding, but it hadn't given him answers. If anything, the weight of what to do next felt heavier than ever. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Silas visited the cabin every 3 or 4 days, bringing supplies and spending a few hours each time. He'd returned Catherine's journal on his 2nd visit, and the sisters had seemed relieved to have it back, handling it like the precious artifact it was. He brought them books, novels, and history and practical guides. He brought medicine, sewing, supplies, salt, and sugar and coffee. He brought news of the outside world, carefully curated, testing their reactions. Emma absorbed everything with fierce intelligence, asking sharp questions. Claire was gentler in her curiosity, more interested in stories about people than facts about politics or technology. They were teaching him too, though they might not have realized it. How to move through the forest, leaving almost no trace, which plants could be eaten and which would make you sick, how to read weather in the behavior of birds and insects. They showed him their mother's garden, now expanded and thriving under their care. They demonstrated the snares they'd improved upon, the water filtration system they'd built, the food preservation techniques they'd mastered. Mama was smart, Emma said one afternoon as they worked together repairing the cabin roof. But we've made improvements. The smokehouse that was our design, the root cellar stays cooler now because of how we ventilated it. We're not just surviving on what she taught us. We're building on it. There was pride in her voice, and rightfully so. These young women had taken their mother's gift of survival and turned it into something more. They'd become expert at living in the wilderness, adapted in ways that took most people years of training to achieve. But Silas also saw the gaps, the things they didn't know and couldn't learn in isolation. Claire asked him once what a smartphone was, having heard the word in one of the books he'd brought. Emma wanted to know about the internet, about how information traveled invisibly through the air. They didn't understand elections or current events. They knew nothing of social media, streaming services, or any of the technology that had become ubiquitous in the decade they'd been gone. "It must seem like we're stupid," Claire said quietly one day, embarrassed by how many basic things she had to ask about. "Not stupid," Silas corrected gently. "Just unaware. There's a difference. You know things I never learned: how to live off the land, how to be truly self-sufficient. That's valuable knowledge. The rest, that's just information. Information can be learned." Still, he worried about what would happen if they ever did return. The world had moved on without them. They'd be strangers in their own time, facing a learning curve that might prove overwhelming. On his 8th visit, Silas brought something different, a small drawing he'd found tucked into Catherine's journal, forgotten between the pages. It showed 2 stick-figure girls holding hands under a smiling sun, with Emma and Claire written in a child's unsteady letters. Emma must have drawn it before they'd disappeared, when she was still young enough to see the world in primary colors and simple shapes. Emma stared at the drawing for a long time when he handed it to her, her expression unreadable. Finally she looked up, and her eyes were wet. "I don't remember being that little. I don't remember being that innocent." "You were just 7, Silas said quietly. "You had a whole life ahead of you." "Had," Emma repeated, past tense. "Still have," Silas insisted. "You're not even 20 yet, Emma. Your life isn't over. It's barely begun." She shook her head. "You don't understand. We can't go back, even if we wanted to, and I'm not saying we do. We wouldn't fit. We don't know how to be normal people. We don't know how to live in houses with electricity and running water. We don't know how to talk to people our age, how to dress right, how to act right. We'd be freaks, curiosities. Those weird girls who lived in the woods. Maybe, at first," Silas acknowledged. "But people adapt. You're proof of that. You adapted to this life. You could adapt back." "Could we?" Claire asked softly. She'd been listening from her spot by the garden. "Or would we just be pretending, trying to fit into a world that left us behind?" It was the question that haunted Silas in his quieter moments. He'd been so focused on whether they could return that he hadn't fully considered whether they should. Was it fair to ask them to abandon the only home they really remembered for a world that would view them as objects of pity or fascination? Was it kinder to let them live out their lives here in peace, or to drag them into a complicated present they weren't prepared for? His visits hadn't gone unnoticed in town, though he'd tried to be discreet. Bill Henderson had commented on how often Silas was heading into the North Woods lately, asked if he'd found a good hunting spot he wasn't sharing. Silas had deflected with a vague answer about tracking patterns, but Bill's eyes had held curiosity. Worse, he'd run into Michael Harper at the feed store last week. The man had aged hard, his face was deeply lined, his movements slow and pained as he leaned on his cane. They'd exchanged brief nods, the acknowledgement of men who knew each other without being friends. But as Silas walked away, he'd felt Michael's eyes on his back, assessing. That night, Silas had lain awake, wondering if Michael somehow sensed something. If 11 years of waiting and wondering had given him an instinct for any change in the pattern, any hint that the mystery might have an answer. It was probably paranoia, but Silas couldn't shake the feeling. He mentioned none of this to the sisters. They had enough to worry about without adding his own anxieties to the mix. Instead, they fell into routines that felt comfortable. Silas would arrive mid-morning. They'd work together on some project, mending the chicken coop, clearing brush, harvesting vegetables, and then they'd sit and talk over coffee or lunch. Emma usually dominated the conversation with her questions and observations. Claire listened more than she spoke, but when she did contribute, her words carried weight. "What was Mama like?" Claire asked one day, "before she took us away. You saw her. Around town, right? At the library?" Silas thought back, trying to remember Catherine Harper from brief encounters. "Quiet," he said. "Polite. She'd help you find a book or recommend something to read, but she didn't chat much beyond that. She seemed," he searched for the right word, "careful. Like she was always aware of her surroundings, always a little on guard." "She was afraid," Emma said flatly. "Always. Even here, even after years of no one finding us, she never fully relaxed. She'd wake up at the smallest sound. She'd have nightmares sometimes, mumbling his name in her sleep. Fear like that doesn't just go away," Silas said. "It becomes part of you." Emma looked at him sharply. "Is that supposed to make us feel better about being terrified of a man we haven't seen in 11 years? "No," Silas said honestly. "It's supposed to help you understand that fear isn't weakness. Your mother's fear kept you alive. And your fear now, that's not irrational. That's your instinct protecting you, just like she taught it to." They sat in silence for a while, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Birds sang in the trees overhead. The chickens scratched contentedly in their yard. It was peaceful here, Silas had to admit. There was something to be said for a life stripped down to essentials, for days measured by work and seasons rather than clocks and obligations. But there was also loneliness in that peace, isolation in that simplicity. And Silas knew, even if the sisters didn't fully understand yet, that humans weren't meant to live completely alone. They needed community, connection, the complicated messiness of relationships and society. "I've been thinking," Silas said carefully, "about introducing you to someone. Not right away, and not if you're not comfortable with it. But my daughter, Sarah, she's about 10 years older than you, Emma. She's kind, trustworthy. She might be able to help you understand what returning would really be like if you ever decided to do that." Emma's shoulders tensed immediately. "Absolutely not. We told you no one else can know." "She wouldn't have to know where you are," Silas said. "I could describe you as hypothetical. 2 young women I know who've been isolated. Get her perspective without revealing anything specific." "It's too risky," Emma said. But there was something in her voice, a hesitation, maybe even a hint of curiosity. "Think about it," Silas said. "That's all I ask. Just think about it." As he rode home that evening, Silas felt the weight of time passing. 3 weeks had built trust, but trust alone couldn't solve their dilemma. Eventually, a decision would have to be made. Eventually, the secret would have to be shared or kept forever. And Silas was beginning to realize he couldn't make that choice for them. He could only help them understand what their options were and support whatever decision they made. The question was whether he had the wisdom to do that right. Silas was in town picking up supplies when he saw the ambulance outside Johnson's auto repair. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, the way people do when something happens in a small town. He pulled his truck over and approached Bill Henderson, who stood with his arms crossed, watching. "What happened?" Silas asked. "Michael Harper collapsed," Bill said, shaking his head. "Right there in the shop. They're loading him up now." Silas watched as paramedics wheeled a stretcher out. Michael Harper looked smaller than he remembered, diminished, his face grey beneath the oxygen mask. Their eyes met for just a moment as they loaded him into the ambulance, and something passed between them, recognition, maybe, or just the acknowledgement shared between 2 men who'd both lived long enough to know how fragile life really was. "Been sick for a while, I heard," Bill continued. "Cancer, stage 4. Doctor gave him maybe 6 months, and that was 4 months ago." The words hit Silas, harder than expected. Cancer, the same disease that had taken Margaret, the same slow theft of vitality, the same inevitable countdown. He thought about the man he'd been watching for weeks, wondering if he posed a threat, thinking of him as a monster from Catherine Harper's descriptions. But the man on that stretcher had just looked tired and scared and human. "Didn't know he was that sick," Silas said quietly. "Keeps to himself mostly," Bill said. "Works when he can, but I heard he's been having to take more and more days off. Guess today it caught up with him." That evening, Silas found himself doing something he hadn't planned on. He drove to the county hospital. He told himself he was just checking to make sure Michael Harper was stable, that he needed to assess whether the man still posed any threat to his daughters. But truthfully, he wasn't sure why he was going. Some instinct pulled him there. He found Michael in a semi-private room, alone, hooked up to various monitors. The man's eyes opened as Silas entered, and for a moment, neither spoke. "Silas Boone," Michael said finally, his voice rough. "Didn't expect visitors. Don't have many people who'd bother." "Heard what happened," Silas said, remaining near the door. "Wanted to see if you were all right." Michael laughed, a bitter sound. "All right. That's one word for it. Dying's another." He studied Silas with sharp eyes that seemed too alert for a man who just collapsed. "But you didn't come here out of neighborly concern. Something else brings you." Silas pulled a chair closer to the bed, sitting down slowly. He'd spent weeks thinking about this man, building an image of him from Catherine's words and the sisters' fear. Now, face to face, he needed to understand who Michael Harper actually was. "Your daughters," Silas said, watching carefully for reaction. "Emma and Claire. You think about them much?" Pain crossed Michael's face, genuine pain, not the calculated expression of a manipulator. "Every day, every single day, for 11 years. You know what it's like, thinking your children are dead? Knowing they've vanished and you'll never know why, never know what happened, never get to say goodbye? What do you think happened to them?" Michael was quiet for a long moment. "Catherine took them. I know everyone investigated me, thought maybe I did something, but I knew it was her. She was terrified of me by the end, thought I was some kind of monster." He paused, his jaw working. "Maybe I was. Not the monster she thought I was, but a monster nonetheless." This wasn't what Silas expected. "What do you mean?" "I was angry," Michael said, his voice thick. "After the divorce, angry at her for leaving, angry at myself for losing my family, angry at the world. I never hit her, I swear to you. I never laid a hand on Catherine or my girls. But I terrorized her in other ways, showing up unexpectedly, making veiled threats, letting her know I was watching. I thought I was fighting for my family. What I was really doing was destroying whatever chance we had at peace." He coughed, a wet rattling sound, and reached for water. Silas helped him drink, processing these words. "The police investigated," Silas said. "Neighbors reported hearing screaming. Catherine would scream at me to leave her alone," Michael admitted. "And I would, eventually. But not before I'd made sure she knew I could stay as long as I wanted, could show up whenever I felt like it. I never broke any laws. I was always just visiting, just talking, just exercising my parental rights. But the fear I put in her," he closed his eyes, "that was real. That was on me." "She wrote about bruises," Silas said carefully. "Fingerprint marks on her arms." Michael's face crumpled. "From holding her once, trying to stop her from walking away when I was talking. I grabbed her arms, held on too tight. I was drunk and stupid and desperate. When I saw the marks the next day, saw what I'd done, I hated myself. But by then, she'd already filed the police report, already told everyone I was abusive. And I was angry all over again because she was making me out to be worse than I was." "Were you, though?" Silas asked quietly. "Worse than she thought, I mean." Michael opened his eyes, meeting Silas's gaze directly. "No, but I was bad enough. Bad enough that she felt she had no choice but to disappear completely with our daughters. Bad enough that I've spent 11 years living with the knowledge that my anger, my inability to let go, my need to control it, cost me everything. If they're dead, I killed them, as surely as if I'd pulled a trigger. And if they're alive somewhere, hiding from me, then I'm the monster who stole their childhood, their normal lives, everything they should have had. Silas sat back, his mind racing. This was the man the Harper sisters feared, the reason they'd spent 11 years in hiding. But he wasn't the straightforward villain Catherine's journal had portrayed. He was something more complicated, a man who'd done real damage through intimidation and emotional abuse, but who seemed to genuinely regret it. Who seemed, in fact, to be drowning in guilt. "What would you say to them?" Silas asked. "If you could. If they were alive and you got one chance to speak to them." Michael's eyes filled with tears. "I'd say I'm sorry. That I was wrong about everything. That Catherine did what she had to do to protect them from my anger. That I wasted our last years together being bitter and controlling instead of being the father they deserved. I'd tell them I understand why they ran, why they stayed hidden, and I'd tell them—" his voice broke— "I'd tell them they don't have to forgive me, but I forgive Catherine. For leaving, for taking them, for doing what she thought was right. I spent years being angry at her for it. But she was protecting our girls from me. How can I be angry about that?" Silas pulled a folded paper from his jacket. Pocket a printout he'd found at the hospital administration desk while looking for Michael's room. A treatment plan, a prognosis, laboratory results. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer, metastasized to liver and lungs. 2 months, maybe 3 if he was lucky. Michael Harper was dying, and judging from the dates, he'd known for almost 6 months. "You found them, didn't you?" Michael asked suddenly, his voice sharp. "That's why you're here. That's why you're asking these questions. You found my daughters." Silas didn't answer immediately. He thought about Emma and Claire, about their fear and their resilience. He thought about Catherine's journal, about promises made and kept. He thought about trust and wisdom and the terrible weight of making decisions that would change lives. "If I had," Silas said carefully, "if someone had found them alive, what would you want for them?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Peace, safety, whatever life they've built for themselves, whatever makes them happy, I'd want them to have that. I'd want them to know their father isn't a threat anymore, can't hurt them anymore. I'd want them to be free of the fear I put in their hearts." He paused. "But I'd also want them to know I loved them, that every mistake I made came from loving them too much and too poorly. That I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's all I have left to give." Silas stood, tucking the medical report back in his pocket. He'd come here expecting to find a monster, and instead found a dying man drowning in regret. It didn't erase what Michael had done, didn't invalidate Catherine's fear or the sisters' current terror, but it complicated everything in ways that made his next steps less clear, not more. "I hope you find peace," Silas said, and meant it. "I won't," Michael said simply. "Not in this life, but maybe I can help them find it, even if I never see them again. If you do know where they are, if you're helping them somehow tell them they're free, tell them I'm dying, and whatever hold I had over their lives died a long time ago. Tell them to live, just live." As Silas walked out of the hospital into the cool evening air, he felt the weight of this new information settling on his shoulders. Everything had just changed. The straightforward equation of protecting the sisters from a dangerous father had become something far more complex. Michael Harper was dying, genuinely remorseful, asking for nothing but wanting his daughters to know they were released from their fear. But could they ever believe that? Could words from a dying man undo 11 years of terror? Could Emma and Claire find it in themselves to trust that the monster of their memories had transformed into something else, something broken and repentant? And perhaps most importantly, was it even Silas's place to tell them? By revealing Michael's condition and his words, would he be giving them freedom or forcing them to confront something they weren't ready to face? He climbed into his truck, but didn't start the engine. Instead, he sat there in the parking lot as darkness fell, trying to figure out how to help 2 young women navigate the most complicated question of all, whether forgiveness was possible, and if so, whether it was deserved. Silas didn't visit the cabin for 3 days after leaving the hospital. He told himself he needed time to think, to process what he'd learned, to figure out the right approach. But truthfully, he was afraid. Afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of causing more harm than good, afraid that 11 years of Catherine Harper's sacrifice might be undone by his interference. He spent those 3 days working his ranch, doing the kind of hard physical labor that usually cleared his mind. He mended fence lines, repaired the barn roof, cleaned out the chicken coop, but his hands worked while his mind churned, replaying Michael Harper's words, weighing them against Catherine's journal entries, trying to find truth in the space between two very different perspectives. On the second night, he sat at his kitchen table and tried to write a letter. Not to send, he had no way to deliver it, that wouldn't seem strange, but to organize his thoughts, to see his dilemma laid out in black and white. "Dear Emma and Claire," he wrote, then paused. "How did you tell someone that the monster they'd feared for 11 years was dying, that he claimed to be sorry, to have changed, to want nothing but their freedom? How did you ask them to consider forgiveness when their entire existence had been built on justified fear?" He wrote 3 different versions, crumpled each one, and finally gave up. Some things couldn't be planned or scripted. Some conversations had to unfold naturally, had to allow space for emotion and reaction and the unpredictable human element. On the 3rd night, Sarah called. "Dad, you sound distracted," she said. "Is everything okay?" "Just thinking," he replied. "About what?" "You can talk. To me, you know. I'm not just your daughter, I'm also someone who's lived a few decades and made plenty of mistakes. Sometimes it helps to talk things through," Silas almost told her. Almost explained about the cabin, the sisters, the impossible choice he faced. But he'd promised to keep their secret, and breaking that promise even to his own daughter felt like a betrayal. "Just wrestling with a tracking job," he said instead. "Complex situation, no clear right answer. The best tracking jobs are like that, aren't they?" Sarah said. "You told me once that finding something is easy. Knowing what to do once you've found it, that's the hard part." His own words, coming back to him. He'd been teaching her to track when she was 12, and they'd found an injured fox in a trap. Sarah had wanted to free it immediately, but Silas had made her stop and think first. Consider the options, the consequences, the responsibility that came with intervention. They'd ultimately freed the fox and carried it to a wildlife rehabilitation center. It had survived, eventually returning to the wild. But Silas remembered the weight of that decision, the way Sarah had looked to him for guidance, trusting that he'd know the right thing to do. Now he was the one who needed guidance, and there was no wise father to turn to. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said. "I love you." "Love you too, Dad. Call me if you need to talk more." After they hung up, Silas sat in the growing darkness of his living room, thinking about foxes and traps, about intervention and consequence. The Harper sisters weren't injured animals, they were intelligent women, capable of making their own choices. But they were also operating with incomplete information, making decisions based on a past that might not accurately predict the present. On the morning of the 4th day, Silas loaded his truck with supplies and headed toward the cabin. He'd made a decision, though he wasn't entirely confident it was the right one. He would tell them about Michael Harper's condition and his words. He would give them the information and let them decide what to do with it. It was the only path that respected both their autonomy and his obligation to help them. The ride through the forest felt longer than usual. Every familiar landmark seemed weighted with significance. The fallen oak, the creek crossing, the boulder that marked the hidden trail. He was carrying news that would force the sisters to confront the fundamental question their entire existence revolved around, whether their fear was still justified, and if not, what that meant for their future. When he reached the clearing, both sisters were waiting. They must have heard him coming, or perhaps they'd grown attuned to his visiting schedule. Emma stood with her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Claire hung back slightly, but her eyes held curiosity. "Been 4 days," Emma said. "Started to wonder if you'd decided to stop coming." "Had some thinking to do," Silas admitted, dismounting. He left the supplies on his horse, sensing this conversation needed to happen first. I need to talk to you both about something important. Something that's going to be difficult to hear. Immediately, Emma's posture shifted to defensive. What did you do? Who did you tell? I haven't told anyone about you, Silas assured her. That's not what this is about. But something's happened that you need to know about. Can we sit? They moved to their usual spots, Silas on his log, the sisters on theirs, with the clearing between them like neutral ground. Silas took a moment to gather his words, knowing that what he said next would change everything. Your father collapsed 4 days ago, he began. They took him to county hospital, Claire gasped. Emma's face went very still, very blank. Is he dead? Emma asked, her voice carefully controlled. No, but he's dying, has been for months. Cancer, stage 4. Doctor gave him 2, maybe 3 months left. The sisters looked at each other, and Silas couldn't read what passed between them. Relief? Fear? Guilt? Maybe all three. Why are you telling us this? Emma asked. Because I went to see him, Silas said. In the hospital, and we talked about you. Emma stood abruptly. You told him about us. You promised you wouldn't. I didn't tell him anything, Silas interrupted. He doesn't know I found you. But I needed to understand who he really was, what kind of threat he might still pose. And what I learned, he paused, choosing his words carefully. What I learned complicated everything I thought I knew. He told them about the conversation, about Michael's admission of terrorizing their mother, his acknowledgement that Catherine had been justified in her fear. But he also told them about the regret, the guilt that had consumed him for 11 years, the genuine sorrow in his voice when he talked about them. He said if he could talk to you, he'd tell you that you're free, that the man you're afraid of doesn't exist anymore, hasn't for years, that he wants you to live whatever life you choose without fear of him. Emma was shaking her head before he finished. No, you don't understand. People don't change. Not really, especially not men like him. This is manipulation. This is him trying to trick you so you'll lead him to us. He's dying, Emma, Silas said gently. He's got weeks, maybe a month or 2. He's not physically capable of being a threat anymore, and from what I could see, he's not interested in being one either. You can't know that, Emma said, and her voice was rising now. You can't trust anything he says. Mama knew what he was. She spent years documenting it, protecting us from it. And now you're asking us to just what? Believe that he's suddenly a different person because he's dying? People say all kinds of things when they're facing death. It doesn't make them true. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Silas said. I'm giving you information you didn't have before. What you do with that information is your choice. Claire had been quiet through all of this, but now she spoke. Did he? Her voice was small, uncertain. Did he say he loved us? Emma turned to her sister sharply. Don't let him get in your head. He said he loved you too much and too poorly, Silas told Claire. That every mistake he made came from that. He said he's sorry, though he knows that doesn't cover it. And he said if you're alive somewhere, he wants you to be free of the fear he put in your hearts. Tears were streaming down Claire's face now. Mama made us promise. The night she died, she made us swear we'd never go back, never let him find us. How can we even think about this when she gave everything to keep us safe? Your mother made you promise based on who your father was 11 years ago, Silas said. Maybe even based on who she needed to believe he was to justify the choice she made. But people do change. Facing death can change people. I'm not saying you should trust him or forgive him or ever have contact with him. I'm saying you deserve to make an informed choice about your future rather than living in fear of a threat that might not exist anymore. Emma sat back down heavily, her face in her hands. When she looked up, her eyes were red. You're asking us to gamble our entire lives on the idea that a man who terrorized our mother has somehow become safe. What if you're wrong? What if this is all an act, and the moment he knows where we are, he doesn't have to know where you are, Silas interrupted. You could return to society without ever contacting him. You're adults. You could live anywhere, be anyone. The point isn't whether you reunite with your father. The point is whether you're ready to stop running from him." The clearing fell silent except for the wind in the trees and the distant call of a bird. Silas watched the sisters process this information, saw the weight of it settling on their shoulders. He'd given them the truth as he understood it. Now came the hard part, waiting while they figured out what to do with it. "I need to think," Emma said finally. "We both do. It's too much. It's changing everything we thought we knew." "Take all the time you need," Silas said. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither is your father, not for the next few weeks anyway. The choice is yours, it always has been. I'm just trying to make sure it's a choice based on the present, not the past." He stood, giving them space. "I'll come back in 2 days. By then, maybe you'll have some idea of what you want to do next, and whatever you decide, I'll support it. That's my promise to you." As he walked back to his horse, he heard Claire's quiet voice behind him. "Do you think Mama would forgive us? If we didn't stay hidden forever?" He turned back. Both sisters were looking at him with desperate hope in their eyes, wanting permission from someone, anyone, to consider a different path. "I think," Silas said carefully, "your mother would want you to live full lives. What that looks like, that's for you to decide. But she didn't sacrifice everything just to keep you alive. She did it to give you a future. Maybe it's time to claim it." The ride home felt like the longest of his life. When Silas returned 2 days later, he found the sisters waiting for him with packed bags at their feet. His heart both lifted and sank at the sight hope that they were ready to move forward, fear that they might be running deeper into the wilderness instead. Emma stood straight-backed, her jaw set with determination. Claire's eyes were red from crying, but there was resolution in her expression too. Between them sat a small metal box, rusted with age. "We made a decision," Emma said without preamble, "but first, we need to show you something." She picked up the box and led Silas to the back of the cabin, where 3 small crosses marked graves in the shade of a massive pine. 2 were made of wood, carved with careful letters: Catherine Harper, beloved mother, and baby boy Harper. The 3rd was older, the wood weathered almost smooth. "We had a brother," Claire said quietly. "Mama never talked about him much. He was born between us. I would have been 2. Emma 4. He only lived 3 days. The doctors said it was natural causes, but Mama always blamed herself. And our father blamed her too." Emma knelt beside the graves, opening the metal box. Inside were documents wrapped in oilcloth birth certificates, their mother's diary, some photographs, and a single car key. "Mama's car is still here," Emma said, "hidden in a ravine about 2 miles north. She told us where it was before she died, said if we ever needed to leave, we'd have a way out. We've never looked at it, never even gone to see if it still runs. But the key's here, and the registration papers." She handed the documents to Silas. "We stayed up all night talking, fighting mostly, about what Mama would want, about what we owe her memory, about whether we're betraying her by even considering this. We didn't come to any easy answers." "There aren't any," Silas said gently. "But we realized something," Claire continued. "Mama made her choice based on protecting children. We're not children anymore. We haven't been for a long time. We've survived out here because she taught us how, but she also taught us to think, to make hard decisions, to be strong. Maybe the strongest thing we can do is choose our own path instead of just following hers." Emma stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "We want to see him, our father, not to forgive him, not to reunite. We're not ready for any of that, might never be. But we need to look him in the eye, as adults, and tell him that we survived. That Mama's sacrifice wasn't in vain, that we're more than just victims of his anger." "And then?" Silas asked. "Then we'll see," Emma said. "Maybe we'll try living in the world again. Maybe we'll come back here. But we need to make that choice freely, not because we're trapped by fear." Silas felt emotion tighten his throat. These young women had come so far from the terrified girls he'd first encountered. "That takes real courage. Your mother would be proud." "Would she?" Claire's voice wavered. "We're doing the one thing she made us promise never to do." "She made you promise based on what she knew then," Silas said. "But circumstances change. People change. She loved you enough to do anything to protect you, including asking you to hide forever. But I think she'd love you enough now to want you to live freely too. Emma picked up her bag. We need your help. We don't know how to do this, how to contact him, how to arrange a meeting, how to even begin navigating the world we've been away from. We don't have phones or IDs or any way to prove we are who we say we are. I can help with all of that, Silas assured her. But we need to go slow. Do this right. The moment you surface, there will be questions from police, from media, from everyone. We need to prepare for that. Control the narrative as much as we can. We wrote something, Claire said, pulling out a folded paper. An explanation of where we've been, why we stayed hidden, what happened to Mama. We thought maybe if we had it ready, if we could give it to the right people at the right time. That's smart, Silas said, taking the paper. Very smart. We'll make sure the sheriff sees this first, before anyone else. Tom Morrison is a good man. He'll understand the sensitivity here. They stood together in the clearing that had been home to these sisters for 11 years. The garden they'd tended, the cabin they'd maintained, the graves they'd honored, all of it testament to their resilience and their mother's love. Soon this place would be empty again, returned to the wilderness that had sheltered them. Are you scared? Silas asked. Terrified, Emma admitted. But we're also ready. Mama taught us to survive anything. Time to find out if that includes surviving normal life. Claire managed a small smile. Besides, we've faced worse than awkward social situations. We've skinned rabbits and lived through winters with no heat and watched our mother die. We can handle whatever comes next. Yes, Silas said with conviction. You can. He helped them carry their few belongings to where his horse was tied. Everything they owned fit into 2 canvas bags and a small trunk. 11 years of life, reduced to what could be carried out the way they'd come in, with almost nothing but hope and determination. As they prepared to leave, Emma turned back one last time, looking at the cabin, the garden, the graves beneath the pine tree. Goodbye, Mama, she whispered. Thank you for keeping us safe. We'll make you proud. And then they walked away, following Silas down the hidden trail, toward a future that terrified and beckoned them in equal measure. 3 days of careful preparation brought them to this moment. Sheriff Morrison had taken their statement privately, his weathered face showing shock, relief, and deep sadness as Emma read from their written account. He'd kept the media away, giving them space to adjust, to breathe, to prepare for what came next. Sarah had driven up from Portland immediately when Silas finally told her. She'd spent hours with the sisters, patiently explaining technology, social norms, everything that had changed in 11 years. She'd brought clothes that fit, showed them how smartphones worked, helped them understand what returning to society would mean. The sisters absorbed it all with the same fierce intelligence they'd applied to survival. Now they stood outside Michael Harper's hospital room. He'd been moved to hospice care 2 days ago. The cancer had accelerated, the doctors said. Weeks had become days. Emma's hand shook as she reached for the door handle. Claire stood behind her sister, one hand on Emma's shoulder for support. Silas waited nearby, ready to intervene if needed, prepared to leave if they wanted privacy. We can still walk away, Silas said gently. You don't owe him this. We know, Emma said, but we owe ourselves closure. We need to see him, to say what needs to be said, to end this chapter on our terms instead of his. She opened the door. Michael Harper lay in the hospital bed, diminished by illness, his skin grey against white sheets. But his eyes were alert, and when he saw who stood in the doorway, those eyes widened with an emotion too complex to name. Emma? His voice cracked. Claire? Are you really? We're really here? Emma said, stepping into the room but maintaining distance. We're alive. We've been alive this whole time. Michael tried to sit up, but pain stopped him. Tears streamed down his face without shame. Where? How? I thought you were dead. Everyone thought. Mama took us, Claire said softly. She hid us in the wilderness. built us a cabin, taught us to survive, kept us safe from you." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Michael closed his eyes, fresh tears leaking from beneath his lids. "From me? God help me. From me. She died 3 years ago," Emma continued, her voice hard. "An accident. Infected wound. She died protecting us from you, and we've been alone ever since. 11 years of our lives gone. 11 years of childhood, education, friends, normal experiences, all gone because you couldn't control your anger." "I know," Michael whispered. "Silas didn't tell me you were alive, but I knew someone had found you. I could see it in his eyes, the weight he was carrying. And I've been lying here praying he'd bring you to me, terrified he would, hoping he wouldn't, because you deserve better than having to face me. But here you are." He looked at them with devastating clarity. "You were 7 and 9 babies. And I was so consumed with rage at your mother for leaving, so convinced I had a right to my family, that I terrorized you all. I never hit you, never touched you in anger, but I let you see what I was capable of. I let you grow up afraid of your own father. There's no forgiveness for that. There's no making it right." "No," Emma agreed. "There isn't. But we needed to tell you something," Claire said, and her voice was steadier than her sister's. "We survived. We're strong. We're capable. We're more than just the scared little girls you remember. Mama made sure of that. She taught us everything, how to live, how to think, how to endure. And we did endure. We're here, and we're okay. And you don't get to have that power over us anymore." Michael nodded, more tears falling. "That's all I wanted. All I've wanted since I understood what my actions cost. For you to be okay, to be safe, to be free of me." He reached toward his bedside table, his hand trembling. "May I?" "There's something." Emma tensed, but nodded. Michael pulled out a worn photograph, the same one from the missing persons flyers. The Harper family at the county fair 11 years ago. Emma and Claire holding hands, gap-toothed smiles, before the world fractured. "I carried this every day," Michael said. "Looked at it every night. Remembered who you were before I ruined everything. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve to know you now, but I need you to understand you were loved. Badly, destructively, wrongly, but loved. And your mother, Catherine, she loved you enough to do the impossible. She was braver than I ever was." Emma took the photograph with trembling fingers, staring at faces that belonged to different people, a different time. "Mama never stopped loving you," she said quietly. She wrote about it in her journal. "She hated what you'd become, feared what you might do, but some part of her remembered who you were before the anger. That's what made it so hard. For her loving and fearing the same person." "I'm so sorry," Michael said, "for all of it, for everything. I can't undo what I did, can't give you back what you lost. But I can tell you this, you're free. Whatever life you build from here, build it without fear of me. I'm dying, but even if I weren't, I'd never be a threat to you again. That part of me died years ago, and good riddance to it." Claire moved closer to the bed, close enough to reach out if she wanted to, though she didn't. "We're going to be okay," she said. "We don't know what comes next, but we'll figure it out. We always do." "You will," Michael agreed. "You're Catherine's daughters. You're survivors." They stood in silence for a moment, 3 people connected by blood and trauma and complicated love, finding what closure was possible when some wounds could never fully heal. Finally, Emma spoke. "We should go. We have a lot to figure out, and you need to rest. Will you?" Michael's voice broke. "Will you come back? Just once more, before—" "Maybe," Emma said. "Not a promise, but not a refusal either. We'll see." As they turned to leave, Michael called out one last time. "Thank you for coming, for letting me see that you're alive and strong and whole. That's more than I deserved, more than I dared hope for." Emma paused at the door, looking back at the dying man who had shaped so much of her life through fear. "Goodbye, Dad." The word hung in the air like forgiveness, might someday, if the world was kind enough to allow it. Michael Harper died 6 days after their visit, peacefully in his sleep, according to the hospice nurse. Emma and Claire attended the small funeral service, standing at the back of the church, present but apart. They didn't cry, but they stayed through the whole service, listening as a few old friends spoke about the man Michael had been before anger consumed him. When it was over, they left a single flower on his casket, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, closure. 3 months later, Silas stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The autumn air carried the promise of winter, that familiar bite that told him it was time to prepare, to stock up, to hunker down for the cold months ahead. A car came up the long driveway, and he recognized it immediately. The old sedan Sarah had helped the sisters buy, teaching them to drive on quiet back roads until they felt confident enough for traffic. Emma parked and both sisters climbed out, looking different than they had 3 months ago. They wore jeans and simple shirts, their hair cut shorter and more practical. They moved with more ease now, less of that defensive wariness that had marked their first weeks back in society. But they still had that quality that set them apart, a self-sufficiency, a quiet strength that came from having survived the unsurvivable. "Thought you might want company for dinner," Emma called out. "Sarah said you've been eating too many frozen meals." "Sarah worries too much," Silas said, but he smiled. "Though I wouldn't turn down a home-cooked meal if you're offering." They moved into his kitchen with comfortable familiarity. In the months since their return, they'd become regular visitors, filling some of the silence in his house while he helped them navigate their new world. It was an arrangement that worked for all of them. They needed guidance and stability, and he needed purpose beyond maintaining a ranch that felt too big for one person. Claire started on the vegetables, while Emma seasoned chicken. They moved around the kitchen with the same efficient coordination they'd shown in their cabin, that wordless understanding that came from years of relying solely on each other. "Got a call from the community college today," Emma said as she worked. "They're willing to work with us on equivalency testing. Said we could start classes in January if we want to." "That's good news," Silas said. "You thinking about taking them up on it?" "Maybe. It's strange, though, thinking about sitting in a classroom with 18-year-olds, learning things we should have learned years ago. But Sarah says everyone's path is different, that there's no shame in starting where we are." "She's right about that," Silas confirmed. "What would you study?" "Environmental science," Emma said immediately. "Want to understand the wilderness we lived in from a scientific perspective, not just a survival one." "Claire's thinking about library science, like Mama," Claire added softly. "Feel like it would honor her somehow, to work with books the way she did." They settled into dinner, the conversation flowing easily. The sisters talked about their apartment in town, small, but theirs, funded by a combination of donated funds and money from their mother's life insurance policy that had finally paid out. They talked about learning to use computers, about the overwhelming nature of supermarkets, about making their first real friends at a support group for trauma survivors. "It's not easy," Emma admitted. "Some days we just want to run back to the cabin, to the simplicity of that life. The world is so loud now, so complicated, so full of choices and decisions and people. But we're managing, better than managing," Silas corrected. "You're thriving. Don't sell yourselves short." After dinner, they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had shone on a hidden cabin, on 2 frightened children growing into resilient women, on a mother's grave beneath a pine tree. "We went back," Claire said suddenly, "to the cabin. Last week, wanted to make sure the graves were still tended, that Mama's resting place hadn't been disturbed." "How was it?" Silas asked. "Peaceful," Emma said. "The cabin's starting to decay without maintenance, the garden's overgrown, nature's reclaiming it, but it felt right, somehow. That place served its purpose. It kept us safe when we needed safety. Now we don't need it anymore, so it can return to the forest." Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "Been meaning to give you this," he said, handing it to Emma. "Thought you might want it." She opened it to find a compass, new, shiny, the brass, not yet worn smooth by handling. "Silas, this is beautiful, but "Every tracker needs a good compass," he said. "You're navigating a new kind of wilderness now. Figured you could use some help finding your way." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you for everything, for finding us, for keeping our secret, for helping us choose our own path. We wouldn't be here without you." "You would have survived," Silas said. "You always do. I just helped you find another way to survive, that's all." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, three people bound together by circumstance and choice, by secrets kept and truths revealed, by the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is accept help when you need it. "Mama would have liked you," Claire said eventually. "You're like her in a way, doing what's right, even when it's hard, protecting people even when they don't make it easy." "I just did what anyone should do," Silas said. "But most people wouldn't have," Emma countered. "Most people would have reported us immediately or tried to force us back before we were ready. You respected our right to choose." That made all the difference. As the evening deepened and the sisters prepared to leave, Silas felt something he hadn't felt in years: contentment. Not happiness exactly, but something deeper. The sense that his life had meaning beyond maintaining a ranch and waiting for time to pass. He'd found two lost souls and helped them find their way home, not to a place but to themselves. The Harper sisters drove away into the night, their taillights disappearing down the long driveway. Silas stood on his porch, his father's old compass in one pocket, watching them go. They'd be back in a few days. They always came back, needing that anchor, that steady presence in their rapidly changing world. And he'd be here, ready with coffee and conversation and the kind of wisdom that could only come from 6 decades of living, of loving and losing, of making mistakes and learning from them. Somewhere deep in the northern woods, a cabin slowly returned to the earth. A garden grew wild. 3 crosses stood beneath a pine tree, marking lives lived and lost and remembered. It was a place of ghosts now, of memories preserved in weathered wood and whispering trees. But the story that began there had found a different ending, not perfect, not without scars, but honest and earned and real. 2 sisters had emerged from 11 years of hiding to claim the lives their mother had died trying to give them, and an old tracker had discovered that the most important thing he'd ever found wasn't marked on any map or visible to any eye. It was the simple truth that sometimes the greatest act of courage is helping others find their own.